So back in 2017, we bought a Ouija board. I was 11 years old at the time and was obsessed with the paranormal, but my mother was always skeptical with that stuff. She wasn't pure Christian, but she does believe in God and evil spirits. So I finally convinced her to buy the Ouija board. The one we bought was actually just a piece of cloth with a Ouija board design on it. I didn't really want to buy it at first, because I was afraid it wouldn't work the way a normal one would. But my mom bought it anyway, saying it would work like a normal one. So months passed, and we never used it. It just hung up in my room, but I did have a weird experience after we bought it. So it was about a couple of months after we bought it, and I woke up at 5 AM. Even though it was dark out, I got up anyway and turned on the TV. I was just sitting in the living room watching the show Adventure Time when I suddenly saw something out of the corner of my eye. I saw a black shadow darting from the living room where I was and into the hallway that led to my mother's room and my room, where my little sister was sleeping, who was in the second grade at the time. When I turned around, of course there was nothing there. I brushed this off as my eyes playing tricks on me, but after what happened next though, I don't think that was the case. Again, let's fast forward a couple of months later. Me and my sister just got home from school when our mom told us some shocking things. She told us she was experiencing some bizarre things. Things like her thumb going numb randomly for no reason at all, the radio and TV malfunctioning, and our pet birds acting completely nuts, like there was something else in the apartment. I was shocked by this news, but also excited at the same time, because I got to experience paranormal activity for the first time. But things escalated that night. Later that night, my sister was too afraid to sleep in our room because she swore she saw a figure in there that resembled a slender man. I was pretty skeptical because even though I believed in ghosts, I didn't believe in a slender man, but I was still scared anyway. Later, my mom told me that she and my sister were going outside to take our dog named Sophie on a walk. I was scared to stay, but I stayed anyway and tried to take my mind off any spirits that might be in our house. All was well, but then my walkie-talkie that was sitting right next to me suddenly turned on and scared me half to death. The voice coming from the walkie-talkie was male, but because of the terrible audio quality, I couldn't understand him. I ran out of the apartment and down to my mum and sister and told them what happened. My mom said it could have just been railroad workers because there was a railroad right next to our apartment, and sometimes they would be up there working. But this was in the middle of the night, and there weren't any workers, but my mom was still skeptical. But when we got back to our apartment, the TV was frozen and the screen was glitched. I woke up that night at 2 AM and decided to go sleep in my mom's room. My sister was already in there because she woke up before me, and that's when we heard the sounds. That night, me, my sister and my mom heard the sounds of footsteps in the hallway, movie cases falling off our shelf in the living room, and pots and pans in the kitchen. It couldn't have been our pets, because our cat and our dog were in the room with us, and our birds were sleeping in their cage. It wasn't a person, because our apartment door automatically locks when closed, and can't be opened without our key, which was with us. And the only other way in was through our windows, where you would have to climb up a 4-story building to get to. Another thing we heard that night were my walkie-talkies, which turned on again with that same male voice speaking through. After that night, some things went back to normal. Others didn't. One thing was I had to sleep in my mom's room for the rest of the time we lived there, because any time I slept in my room, I would always wake up at 2 AM and couldn't fall asleep for the rest of the night. And my little sister kept claiming she saw shadow figures. Even after we moved into a new house, she would still see them. It wasn't until early 2019 when she stopped seeing them. I'm now 14, in 8th grade, going into 9th grade, and my sister is now 11 and going into 6th grade. My mom threw away the Ouija board after that and says she's never buying one again. Okay, so just for context, my boyfriend had been living in our old place for about 10 years, and I moved in and lived there for about 5. I always felt a presence in the house, but over time, whatever it was targeted me over my boyfriend. If he's someone asking me shit over my headphones, when I'd ask my boyfriend what he was talking about, he would have no idea what I was talking about. I used to have a lot of sleep paralysis in our bedroom, and there was one night I was petrified in the bedroom. So much so that I moved to the living room to sleep because of that. The spare room had some weird energy. We had a camera set up in there while we were kittens sitting for a mate. Anyway, back to the camera. My boyfriend said once that he thought he'd seen static-like figures walking across the screen in the spare room. So there was things like that. It all came to a head when we started packing to move to another property. During the final 2 or 3 days before we left, I started having the sleep paralysis again, which had rarely happened since I left our bedroom for the couch. Once again, I was being sexually assaulted and violently choked. I was pushed and scratched. The cat started staring and hissing at random empty spots. Tempers were flaring. The final night, we had mostly gotten all the big stuff out, and really only had some leftover bits and pieces to do. We were both starving, so we decided to order a pizza, and while we were waiting, my boyfriend had a shower. During that time, I heard a fucking loud moan. Now the house was pretty much empty, so the sound reverberated off the walls. I thought maybe it was my boyfriend in the shower, so when he came out, I made him try and replicate the moan in the shower, with water running to try and debunk it. He did, and that was not the sound I heard. I asked him to make a moaning sound in the lounge or kitchen area, and he did. It wasn't the same moan I heard, but it captured the exact pitch. So that weirded me out. A couple of hours later, we were making a final trip to the van before shutting the door for the night, and we both heard some canned laughter and some kind of talking from a TV show in the distance. It's 3 AM by this stage, and I guarantee no one was watching anything that early and loudly in the morning. And as soon as it started, it stopped once we moved away from the house. I had to run back in one final time, and it started and stopped again. So this has been going on since as long as I can remember. I've always seen shadow people creeping around corners, behind people, close and far. Sometimes that would make me feel absolutely terrified to the bone, and sometimes I felt perfectly safe. We used to be a really religious family, and I remember learning about angels and demons at church, and how everyone had a guardian angel. I rationalised the shadow people as this. One would pop up and stand in the doorway, and another would pop behind, in front or next to it, so I would assume my guardian angel was protecting me from some demon. Fast forward now, and only gets more frequent. They're clear as day, and I can stare at them for up to 30 seconds before they leave. They will be on one side of my counter, and when I look at them, they duck down and hide. Same thing behind the couch and doorways. Sometimes it's only a head, and sometimes it's the whole body and all different sizes. They watch me, and I've always felt like I'm being watched. I have a friend who said he's never experienced anything like this before he met me. I once randomly asked if he'd ever seen anything at my house, and he said yes. He told me when I would go to the shower, something would dash after me from my room into the hallway where the shower was. He said after seeing this stuff, he started noticing at his house. After telling one of my older sisters, she admitted she's always seen stuff like this. But the last time she was at my house, she seen something crouching almost, and it was behind her. So she went to look behind her, and it got up and ran. But it looked at her and had these horrifying pure white eyes. She's never seen them with eyes, so she refuses to come to my house and sages every time someone comes and leaves the house. I've had things thrown in the direction of me, including broken glass. I don't know if it's related, but my other sister has been having these dreams about this woman wanting to take her baby while she was only 1 to 3 months old. It's actually how she found out she was having a daughter. I had a dream a few months ago, horribly vivid, and I don't get nightmares really, but I can recount the absolute dread I felt when the thing came in the house after my sister let it in. My sister was blank-faced, and it was directly behind her with her face over her shoulder. She wanted my niece and nephew, and I wouldn't let her take them. She wouldn't touch me or them, but she got my sister to grab them, and when I went to grab them back from my sister, she immediately dropped her grip on them like she had no power. I told my sister later on and described her, and my sister said she'd been dreaming of this exact woman for the past 12 years. Is it bad that I see shadow people? Could the two separate things be connected? What should I do? I'm a 26-year-old student, going to university, studying veterinary medicine. We're struggling financially, and when COVID-19 hit my country, I decided that I needed to find a job. Got a job in a nursing home. I do the night shift from 8 PM till 8 AM. When I first started, I didn't notice anything strange, but as time went by, I'm feeling more and more uneasy. The first thing I noticed was the hand dryers in the common bathrooms going off for no reason. Only for a few seconds, I thought, okay, that's weird, but oh well. The next thing that happened directly to me was really terrifying. I was downstairs, and the hand dryer from downstairs is the most active one. So I was there alone and had my phone in my jacket pocket. Was walking around going to the coffee machine, and all of a sudden my phone got yanked from my pocket and smashed against the floor. I picked it up and noped out of there like, fuck this shit. The screen broke. Also, once in a while, one of the emergency bells goes off, and we panic because it's a really loud ring and different from the ones in the rooms, and it usually means that someone is in trouble in the bathroom. So we rush there all the time, and there is no one in the bathroom. One night, I was dozing to sleep for a while, and I opened my eyes and saw a dark male figure sitting in the room across from me, just watching me. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me and closed my eyes and fell asleep. This happened last night. The most terrifying so far. I was feeling tired, so I went to the room next to the nurse's office. There were some long chairs there, so I thought I was going to lay down for a little bit. When I got there, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. But I thought, hey, stop being crazy. It's all in your head. I dozed to sleep. A very light sleep. Then, like 20 minutes in, I woke up to the chair shaking uncontrollably. I got up and fell. Thought it was an earthquake. Ran to the other room where my colleagues were and asked, did you fucking feel the earth shaking? And they were confused and said no, you were probably dreaming, and laughed it off. But I know what I felt, and it terrifies me. About a year ago, I would come off at work sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I didn't notice at first, but when I did, I couldn't find any way to explain it, so I've come here for answers. As I merged into the freeway off my work, the first overpass I approached had what seemed to be a beam of light shining on the bridge. Now this by itself is nothing to be wary of. Could be a pedestrian with a flashlight or a car's headlights. What got me sceptical was how it behaved once I approached. It would disappear. You know those moments in your life when you see or hear something you can't quite explain? But it only happens one time, so you delete it from your memory. This was different. This was consistent. Once I noticed, it was hard not to see this happen every single night. Just a mysterious looking light flashing away once I, and only I, drove under it. I looked into some research to see what this could possibly be, and every time I offered an explanation, I was shut down. A car or person's lights. It was far too narrow, straight and bright to be a light like that. Train or tram passing by real fast. The overpass was just a regular 4-lane bridge. Scientific experiment. There was no consistent time. This was happening in the early morning hours. That was the only consistency. Triggering a pressure plate. There were other cars on the road. Why would just mine cause the light to vanish? Car light reflection on the rail as I passed by. Like I said, there were other cars on the freeway, and the nature of the light source couldn't possibly be caused by a car's headlights. As I exhausted all my solutions, I came to the conclusion that it must be a hallucination. It was a new schedule for me. I usually sleep early, but now my body is still going at 2 in the morning, so it must be that I'm fatigued to the point that I'm imagining things. Till I got video proof, and I showed it to my sisters just to see if I wasn't hallucinating the video too. I swear these haven't been messed with. I can't wrap my head around it. I don't understand what happened there. For the record, I only worked there for a couple of months and left March 2019. I've got no clue what this could be anymore. I don't believe in the paranormal, but this might be the one time I make an exception. What is this? This occurred while my grandmother was in a home hospice for dementia. This was sometime between losing her ability to walk and not understanding conversation. To put into some perspective, my grandmother was in a room towards the back of the house, while my bedroom is closer to the front. The kitchen is towards the front of the house as well, so there is decent space between my grandmother's room, my bedroom, and the kitchen. I was laying in bed one night hearing a deep breathing. I have a dog, and I thought that maybe he was snoring or having difficulties breathing, but it wasn't coming from where he was, which was in my grandmother's room. I return, lights are turned off, and I hear that breathing again. I hold my breath, and the breathing continues. That's it. It freaked me out enough to turn the lights on, say a full rosary, and have a really uneasy sleep. The next morning, I whispered to my mum what happened in the kitchen. I don't remember her reaction, other than telling me I needed to tell it to go away. I go with my mum to my grandmother's room to help bathe and feed her. At some point, she apologises to me. She said that her father just wanted to look at me and he didn't mean to scare me. That's it. Really minor visitation. Towards the end of my grandmother's life, there were more visits from her relatives and friends. There were sometimes shadows, and you would get a feeling of not being alone. It never felt scary, beyond that first surprise. I think when she died, her father took her away. First of all, my stepmother is Wiccan and regularly practiced witchcraft. When I was younger, she would often practice her craft in the basement and cast spells on me and other family members. This was one of those times. We were in a hotel in St. Louis, Missouri for a family vacation. After a long day of swimming and other outdoor activities, we turned into the hotel for the night. My little sister and I were in one bed, my older brother in the recliner, and my father and stepmother in the other bed. Just as we were getting into bed, my stepmother got up and then left the room, saying she was checking on something. When she returned, she had a far too familiar look on her face, and we knew she had done some sort of ritual while out of the room. She always got a sort of wild look when she did witchcraft, but to be fair, she often did drugs while practicing as well, so that may have been it. So, we all settled into bed, without much of a word. Now, my little sister always insisted on bringing a nightlight whenever we stayed in a hotel. As you could imagine, for having a literal witch of a mother, she wasn't a big fan of the dark. I was laying in bed listening to everybody else snore away, when I noticed some movement on the ceiling. This is where things get paranormal. Despite the nightlight, there was a shadow splayed across the ceiling. It was a humanoid figure, but my body told me it was definitely inhuman. The shadow feet sprouted from the top of the door, with legs and a body protruding into the room, culminating in a head a few feet from the bed. It was completely motionless, and almost seemed to be made of smoke, as its image shifted slightly as I looked in horror. My fear only grew as I realised that despite the impossibility, the shadow had 2 eye holes, and I could tell it was looking straight at me. I began to shiver in fear, wanting to scream but afraid to do so. Then I heard shuffling across the room. My older brother, evidently uncomfortable in his sleeping arrangement, had gotten up to use the restroom. As he walked across the room, the nightlight now cast his shadow across the ceiling as well. As he walked, his head's shadow got closer to the other shadow's own head, and when they finally met, the shadow instantly snaked across the ceiling, almost like it was melting, back to the door and out of the room. My brother, too busy trying not to trip on his way to the bathroom, took no notice of me or the shadow. He did his business and then returned to his chair. Too scared to sleep, I laid staring at the ceiling for what seemed like hours, until at some point I passed out, only waking up after being shaken awake by my father. I spent the rest of the day watching over my back and staying out of the shadows. That night shook me to my absolute core. To this day, I'm very wary of shadows in the dark and tend to stay away from basements because of my stepmother. I feel even more sorry for my little sister who had to live with her for many more years. For years, I've worked at a small grocery store in the American Midwest as an overnight stocker and weekend manager. The business has been family-owned for generations, and my family has been intertwined with them since the beginning. The owners became close friends with my family and would often go to gatherings and such to visit. The owner at the time, the father of the current owner, was a kind man who spent most of his 30-ish years of ownership at the store, working 10 to 12 hours a day. He was sort of a grandfather figure to me and many others, and when he passed in 2010, we were all heartbroken. A few years after the owner, who I will refer to as Bob, passed away, I finally got a job working at the store. Since my family was close to the owners, I quickly moved up the ranks to overnight worker and eventually to weekend manager. Over the years, me and other employees noticed certain odd things happening in the early morning hours, between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. usually. Things would inexplicably fall from shelves, automatic doors would open for nobody, and the motion-activated lottery machines would go off, even though nobody was there. After a while, we suspected some sort of paranormal activity and reported it to the current owner. He simply said, "That must be Bob." Most of the time these occurrences were harmless, likely because Bob didn't want any harm to come to the store his family had owned and operated for generations. He also never revealed himself to a customer, not that we have ever had reported at least. I had never had any direct encounter, only seen on cameras or heard from co-workers, until, that is, the night of the balloon. As an overnight stocker, I would work from shortly before closing to shortly before opening the next morning, usually 10 till 6. This meant that the only people in the store for most of the shift were me and my 2 co-workers. It just so happened on this night that the grocery truck was rather small, so we got all of the grocery stock up by 3 a.m. and just had the dairy products left. My co-workers, not obligated to stay for anything other than the grocery stock, promptly left. By 3:30, I was completely alone. As I filled the shelves with cheese, milk, and various other dairy products, my mind began to wander. Suddenly, a face appeared in my mind, clear as though I'd seen it that day. It was the face of Bob, wearing the big smile he always had, even after a long day. I became a little sad thinking about him, so I decided to take a quick break and get a drink. I finished the box I had and made my way to the end of the aisle. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks as an icy cold spot hit my chest. I looked around and laid eyes on a balloon floating at chest height a few feet away. Written on the balloon were 2 words, "Thank you," in big letters. I was completely frozen, stuck to the spot. The balloon had no business being on this side of the store. I was in the opposite corner of the building. No draft would have carried it there. After a minute or so, I unglued myself from the floor and carefully walked around the balloon towards the back room. I went to the back office to check the cameras and ensure the balloon did in fact exist, only to find it slowly floating down the dairy aisle. "Okay, Bob," I said with a slight grin. "I'll get it finished before I go." With that, I returned to the aisle, the balloon floating a few feet away, and worked for another hour or so to finish. Once I was done, I grabbed the balloon, carried it back to our floral department, and deflated it. I laid it flat on the desk and left a note for the worker who would open it in the morning. One of Bob's granddaughters. From Bob. My grandfather was a man who smoked more than any man I've ever seen. Cigarettes, cigars, home-rolled, it didn't matter. He smoked it all. He was never really into chewing tobacco or patches, and he heavily favoured cigars over anything else. There was a particular brand he would smoke. I don't recall exactly what it was, but he would carry them around with him in a specially carved metal case, and would smoke them almost all day. He worked a stressful job in the government for most of his working years, which is where he obtained his habit. And after he retired, it stuck around until the day he died. I was very little when he passed away, less than 10 years old, but I can still remember the smell of those cigars he would smoke. Not that I liked the smell. In fact, I hate smoking, but it was such a distinct scent that it only ever meant one thing. Grandpa is here. Even years after he died, my grandmother especially would claim to have visits with Grandpa, saying that they would sit and chat for hours. I always assumed this was just her way of dealing with the grief, imagining that he was still there and having a long conversation with him. She would always complain about the smell of cigars he left after he disappeared again, saying it would hang in the air for hours. It wasn't long before other family members began to have similar experiences. First my mother, then my stepfather, then my uncle. The story was always the same. They would be alone in the house or the car, and suddenly the smell of those cigars would fill the room, blocking out every other scent. It would get cold, even in the summer, and my mom even said she could hear him coughing as though he were in the walls or above the ceiling. She told me that one day he would come pay me a visit too, and I would know by the smell that followed him, even beyond the grave. It wasn't long before she was proven right. My family and I took a road trip down Route 66 to Las Vegas, where we would be staying for the week. I was 16 at the time and hadn't heard anything more about my grandfather for some time. I thought perhaps he had finished whatever business he had on Earth and had finally passed on, but it turned out I was wrong. We were in New Mexico, a little more than 3 days into our drive. It was a blisteringly hot day, over 100 degrees and not a cloud in sight. It was just me, my mother, and my stepfather in the car, a small blue sedan. There were hardly any other cars on the road, and the endless desert stretched as far as the eye could see, in every direction. Suddenly, my mother gasped as we all smelled that oh-so-familiar smell. "We have a visitor," my mother said calmly. The smell wafted through the air for a few miles, filling my entire consciousness. My head filled with thoughts of my grandfather, and I began to feel an icy cold breeze, even despite the horrendous weather. After a while, the smell dissipated, and the climate returned to the obscene hotness it was. This marked the only time to date I've been visited by my grandfather, but other family members have reported him multiple times afterwards, even as recently as this year. I was working at Starbucks and was about 15 minutes into my shift. I remember being in a really great mood, and right before leaving for work, my husband and our roommate were heading out the door to walk to a gas station a block away. While I'm making drinks, I hear the store phone ring across the room, and I immediately look over to my co-worker, and she answers it, because I know it's for me. I also remember knowing that something was wrong. Right after answering the call, my co-worker looked up and locked eyes with me, since I was already staring right at her, which was creepy. So in the moment I just smiled to calm her down, but I don't think it helped when I said, "It's for me." Someone stepped in for me, and I came over quickly. It was my roommate, and the first thing he said was something along the lines of, "First, I need you to stay calm." I said, "I'm calm. What happened?" Because since I had already known something was wrong before I answered, I didn't have any rush of panic. I also somehow didn't feel scared of what it was going to be. Like I already knew it was something that would pass. Anyway, he explained that while crossing the street, a huge pickup truck had run the light and hit both of them while trying to turn on the red light. My roommate was a big guy, so he immediately caught the driver's attention and only stumbled before the driver hit the brakes. My significantly smaller husband was thrown to the ground and badly injured from the impact. He said they were already in an ambulance, and by then, he was still hurting, but was joking around with the paramedics and was optimistic about everything. They insisted he was alright and didn't need me there, which again I somehow knew before they even told me. I thanked him for the call and told my husband I loved him and joked with him a little, then got back to work. Of course, I proceeded to tell my co-workers what happened, still casual and smiling, and they of course freaked out, and the supervisor asked if I wanted to leave to go to him. But I wasn't worried or stressed or anything, and said I was fine to stay, and just treated it like a crazy start to the day. I'm positive it probably came off like a setup for getting the day off, until I rejected the offer, especially with how obvious it was that I knew the call was for me. Anyway, he's basically fine now after some long physical therapy, and goes for walks to the same gas station. I don't mind this kind of foresight if it's going to keep me from another anxiety attack. I went to the Grand Canyon Hotel in Williams, Arizona, as a rest stop before heading to the Grand Canyon via the Grand Canyon Railway the following morning. We chose the hotel because it was cheap, and it was also said to be the oldest hotel in Arizona. At first sight, it was a beautiful hotel. The lobby was decorated with historical memorabilia and foreign currencies gifted by previous customers. After check-in, the front desk told us to check out the rooms and see which one we wanted to use. As we walked up the stairs, we were greeted by an old picture of an old lady. Judging from it, it looked like something from the late 19th or early 20th century. We were checking out the different rooms when my friend told me she felt like something tapped her on the shoulder. I joked around saying it was a ghost. Normally, I'm a paranoid mess, but on this night I just wanted to rest after driving all the way from LA, and super excited for the next day. I chose a room next to a hallway. If you search for the hotel on Expedia or some other travel site, it's the room with the sailor uniform in it. At midnight, I went to bed. Didn't have any paranoid thoughts. Went to bed peacefully. Then at around 1 in the morning, I hear footsteps. I hear footsteps outside my room. Thinking it's the neighbouring guests, I try to go back to sleep. Then the footsteps reappear, this time in my room. I'm terrified at this point, so I open my eyes and sit up on the bed. Silence. So I go back to sleep. I should also mention that the bed that I was sleeping on was an extremely soft bed. If you sat down on the left side of the bed, I would completely roll over to your side. So, I was sleeping once more and the footsteps came back. Again, in my room. Except this time, it sounded like it was running around. Terrified, I keep my eyes closed. My arms start to go up and down on the bed. There's something walking on my bed. After hesitating, I open my eyes. Right in front of my eyes were two extremely pale butt cheeks. My head is between my legs. They were small. It was obviously a child's ass. Couldn't tell which gender the body belonged to, but it was very much a child's pale blue ass. Then I closed my eyes once more, heart beating faster than it's ever been. Then I open my eyes. It's gone. After a few minutes of silence, I reach for my phone and watch some of The Office to cheer me up, and go to bed around 6 in the morning. I talked to the front desk in the morning, and they said there's no reports of ghosts in the hotel. If any of you have visited the hotel and have been visited by something or someone, please let me know. That was my very first haunting, and I want to know more about the child that visited me in the middle of the night. I was always skeptical of the paranormal. Now, I'm a firm believer. I stayed in this hotel, and yes, we had a strange experience. I'm from Australia, and the person I was with is originally from New York. We were on a very loosely planned, last-minute road trip. Just enjoying each other's company on the open road, seeing the sights and stopping overnight wherever we needed to. We had arrived at the end of the day, having driven from Vegas. No real plans to stop at Williams, no reason to. Not even sure why we did. It was just a blip on the map. This was 2011. My suggestion was always to look to the centre of a town to find somewhere historical or significant to stay. We arrived around early dinner time. We went in, and the place seemed deserted. We stood chatting in the lobby, looking at historical photos and the paraphernalia. A couple emerged from behind the desk and showed us upstairs. The hallways had all these old sepia photos of people that kind of bulged out of the frame. I must admit, it was mildly creepy, but only for a moment, as the adventurous feeling of finding the nostalgic place overrode the creepiness. There were different rooms. The nautical-themed one seemed the nicest, but I wanted a street window room. We ended up in the honeymoon room, or something like that. It also had a nice ensuite. The room had an old wedding dress hanging on the wall next to the bed, and yes, that was creepy. The woman told us that it was inside a chest that they found in the desert. My friend and I glanced at each other when she said that, and raised our eyebrows. But again, I didn't think too much about it. After booking in, we walked up the street to a rock and roll hot rod style diner and had a meal. Upon returning, my friend said she didn't like the old dress hanging on the wall, so I carefully hung it in the cupboard that was between the ensuite and the door to the room. It was a bit off-putting, and the first thing your eyes went to in the room. There were also a pair of long white debutante-type gloves hanging over a little shelf on the other side of the bed, up above the radiator. The warm air from the radiator below made the fingers move. We knew the gloves were moving due to the heat from the radiator, so it was more funny than creepy. We went to sleep, and then around 3 AM, I was woken by creaking floorboards near the door. The sort of thing where I would normally just check into the sound in my mind, listen for a minute without opening my eyes, and go back to sleep. The floors were creaky, so I thought it was just other guests that had booked in. Then I realised the creaking and shuffling sounded more like it was inside the room, not out in the hall. I could feel my friend in the bed next to me, so it wasn't her going to the bathroom. I opened my eyes and lifted my head to see if someone else was in the room. I didn't see anything. It was weird. I lay there listening, but I drifted off, relegating the sound to being an old building and me being half asleep. Then, about an hour or so later, it woke me again. This time, the creaking sound like actual footsteps walking across the room towards the bedside. It sort of repeated a couple of times as I was waking up. No mistaking it. I lay there still for a moment, gathering my thoughts, thinking there's someone in the room, and I need to take action. My friend had obviously woken too, and nudged me as if to say, "Did you hear that?" I quickly sprang up and peered around the room. There was nothing, but it definitely sounded like someone had walked across the room and stood next to the bed, then went back towards the door, then back to the bed again. Coincidentally, the path of the steps was from over near the door, next to the cupboard with the wedding dress, across to the side of the bed where the wedding dress had been hanging. It was very clear, and almost like you could feel someone standing next to the bed. I switched on the lights and checked the door, went to the toilet while I was up and kind of walked around the room, in an effort to make my friend feel safe and show her that everything is okay. I basically stayed awake for the next hour and a half, maybe dozing slightly, then getting up at sometime around 6. Having dozed a little more deeply for a little while, once the morning light made the room feel a little less ominous. We mentioned it to the people the next morning as we checked out, and they just looked at us blankly, not really engaging in the subject. They weren't rude, just awkward. We then went and had breakfast in a snowboarder cafe, back up the road near the diner, and recounted the events, both agreeing that something unexplainable had happened. Not sure if the wedding dress really had anything to do with it or not, but it was definitely hard to explain away as nothing, and we both felt it wasn't random old building noises. So yes, there is something weird about the place. "So she just sits there?" I asked, "and you're just staring at her like a creep?" No, not like that. It's like she wants you to look, you know?" grinned Reggie. "She shows off her legs, her white little panties. She throws her red hair around." "That doesn't make you any less creepy." "She knows I'm there. Hell, last time she smiled at me." "She smiled at you," I scoffed. "A human woman actually smiled at you? You, Reggie?" "I get a hell of a lot more smiles than you," he teased. "And I swear, she smiled at me. I'm telling you, I'm in love." "Tinder not working out for you? Super likes not getting you anywhere?" "If I had to choose between a random woman smiling at me from a window once every 2 weeks, or getting a match that isn't a bot on the Tinder meat market, I'd choose window girl 10 times out of 10. "I'll drink that." And so we did. 6 shots of tequila and a game of pool later, we said our goodbyes. Then he disappeared. One day, he was just gone. No messages, no logins, no goodbyes, no witnesses, no indication of him going anywhere. There were rumours of him being attacked. There'd been news of an up-and-coming masked gang harassing a neighbouring town, but nothing was confirmed. The police did a decent job bringing in the usual suspects, but nothing came of it. They even had search parties looking around the old campgrounds. There was talk of having a diver check the lake, but I don't think they ever did. Of course, they were following all leads. All leads but that one thing Reggie'd rambled about on that last night when I saw him. The pretty girl who'd smiled at him from a window. It was a struggle to find out anything about her. This is a big town, and Reggie travelled pretty far from work to home. I must have travelled that same road 100 times, back and forth, looking for whatever window he could have seen her in. But he wasn't very specific. There were apartments, houses, rentals, motels, hundreds of windows all along the road. How would I know which one he'd been looking at? I started taking Reggie's road home every day from work, just to see if I could see what he saw. It was a hassle, but it gave me a pretty good idea about where he'd look and what he'd do. It wasn't a long way out of my ordinary route, and I wasn't planning on doing it forever. so I told myself I had to at least try. 6 weeks after his disappearance, I was ready to give up. The police already had. The case had gone cold, and there were no more leads to follow. One night, as I followed that same damn road, I stopped at a corner shop to get a Coke. Standing with a cold can in the evening breeze, a thought struck me. Maybe the woman wasn't just someone he happened to see randomly. Maybe it was someone he went out of his way to see. Someone slightly off his usual route. Like someone you might see when you step out to get a Coke. Right across the street from the corner store, just above a bookstore, was a small apartment. It had this wide window alcove that overlooked the street. There was someone sitting in the window. She wasn't at all what Reggie had described. She wasn't flaunting her underwear or flipping her hair around. She was this 20-something young woman, cuddled up in the alcove, reading. She had these big dorky glasses and long brown hair. Not red, like Reggie had said. Striking green eyes, just like my first crush had back in middle school. Still, I couldn't help but stare. This had to be her. This was the woman Reggie had talked about, and I could see why he'd fallen in love. It was damn near impossible not to. I must have stood there for the better part of 5 minutes. I had every intention to check the address, see who lived there, and try to find out all I could about her. And yet, all I did was stand there and gawk as she gently turned the pages. Then, as soon as her head moved in my direction, I looked away and hurried back to my car. It was embarrassing, to say the least. I could still see her in the rearview mirror as I got back out on the road. I'd talk to her the next day, or maybe the day after that, whenever I could work up the courage and maybe find out a bit more about her. I did find out a few things. That corner apartment wasn't a rental, so someone owned it. It hadn't been sold in the past 20 or so years, so whoever owned it had lived there for a while. It was one of the older houses in town, and there were pictures of it from all the way back in the 60s. Even the same bricks, only slightly paled by the sun. The following weekend, I went back during the day. This time, the window was empty. I took the time to just walk around and check the place out, see if I could get a name. I took the time to check out the bookstore under the apartment. It was this old, dusty place that I'd seen for years, but never actually bought anything from. It was run by these two older men, bickering about some nonsense in one of the back rooms. As soon as I entered and that bell rang, I saw their two heads peeking out. "Hey," I called out. You the owners?" They looked at each other, paused, and sighed in unison. One of them, the one without a lengthy beard, approached me. "Are you looking for something?" he asked. "It's about, the apartment. I don't know if you—" They both rolled their eyes. The man in the back shook his head and went back to his computer. "Of course you are," the beardless old man sighed. "I'm sorry, we can't help you." "I'd appreciate whatever you know. You've never talked to her?" "I haven't even seen her, sorry. My partner told me he's seen her brother once." I could hear a jubilant "I have" from the back room. I got the feeling that they'd had this discussion a few times already. "I'm sorry, they keep to themselves. We don't want to bother them." "Have they ever been down here? Bought anything? I saw her reading." "Might have," he nodded, "but I wouldn't know. I don't ask every customer where they live. Maybe we ought to start." He gave me an apologetic shrug and returned to the counter. I thanked them, waved, and left. I asked around the neighbourhood, random people on the street, passers-by who seemed familiar with the area. At one point, I called out to a half-naked woman sunbathing in a yard. I talked to a dozen or so people, and no one had anything clear to say about the woman who lived above the bookstore. Some claimed she lived alone, others said she lived with a brother. Some thought it was her father or her husband, but it was clear she wasn't living alone. One man claimed he'd seen an older woman walking up around there, so maybe it was a whole family. Then again, they didn't seem to have a car, and no one's seen them leave. I was getting a funny feeling about the girl living there. It wasn't a large apartment, so I couldn't imagine so many people living there. 1 or 2, sure, but 3? 4? No way. I decided to take matters into my own hands. It took me a lot of stomping around to build up the courage, but I made my way up the stairs to the apartment door. The name on the door just said Murray. Strange family name. I stood outside her door for a solid minute before I knocked. Had I known she wasn't home, I wouldn't have bothered. I knocked 2 more times, but there was no one to answer. Instead, I just stood there like an idiot. If I had any paper, I'd leave a note. I did take a mental note of the other 2 apartments on the same floor, being empty though. Strange. I started going by that street regularly, once a day, waiting for her to show up in the window again. Every time, sometimes more than once, I passed that street. I was starting to wonder if I was still doing this to find out what happened to Reggie, or if I was genuinely interested in that woman I'd seen in the window. Maybe it wasn't even the same person. After all, she looked nothing like the woman Reggie had described. It took me 2 weeks of diligent watching to finally see her again, but when I did, I nearly got in an accident. I slammed on my brake, shocking the driver behind me. I parked outside the corner store, and I just stood in the middle of the dark street, gawking at her. It was the same woman, same brown hair. Another book, it looked like, and she'd cuddled up with a blanket. There was a cup of something warm next to her, fogging up the inside of the window. I could see those emerald eyes all the way down the street. She was magnificent. In a moment of onset stupidity, I waved at her. I couldn't help myself. To my surprise, she turned to me. She put her book down, tilted her head, and met my gaze. She looked bored, frustrated even. There I was, some random man on the street, waving at a young woman in the privacy of her home. I was being an idiot. Then she smiled at me, and I fell in love. This warm, genuine emotion. She was so happy to see me. She was eager to meet me, I could tell. I had to go see her. I ran across the parking lot, crossed the street, and went around the back of the building. But as I put my hand on the door to the apartment complex, I felt a tiny drop of water on the back of my hand. For a moment, it made me stop, just long enough to think. As 1 drop turned into 100, I snapped out of it. This was too strange. I'm not a bad-looking man, but finding myself running across the street to knock on a stranger's door, that ain't me. I wasn't being myself. Maybe the same thing happened to Reggie. I wiped the rain from my face and went inside. I hadn't even noticed the strange blue mesh bags used for garbage piled in a corner of the hallway. This time, I felt a bit more observant. But I still walked up those stairs, and I still knocked on the door. Not just to see a pretty face, but to ask questions. This time, she was home. I knocked 3 times firmly. "Come in," a soft voice spoke. "I just want to ask a few questions," I said, "about a friend of mine." "Come in," the voice repeated. I took a deep breath and felt the handle. It was open. This wasn't right. A lone woman letting a strange man into her apartment at this hour? Sure, this wasn't a big town, but this was just odd. Shouldn't she at least meet me at the door? I could see a shine from the peephole. She was nowhere near the door. She wasn't even looking out. "Do you mind coming out for a sec?" I asked. "It won't take long." "Come in." "I'm sorry to bother you. It's just, come in." My stomach slowly turned as a chill crept up my spine. I let go of the handle and backed away. "I'm sorry. Can you hear me all right? I think the door..." "Come in." Oh, she heard me. No way she didn't. Was she mocking me? "I need to talk to you. I'm not coming in." No response. A shadow suddenly blocked the light from the peephole. Someone was looking out at me, and I hadn't even heard her move. I took a step back, leaning against the wall across from the door. "I should leave," I said. I'm not..." "Come in." This time, the voice was harsher, insistent. It wasn't an invitation anymore, it was a request. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I just kept backing further and further away from the door. As I reached the stairs, I heard a mechanical sound. A click. A lock. I peeked down the stairs. I could see someone by the exit. A shadow locking the door from the outside. Reggie? I didn't get time to think as I heard a creaking noise. The front door was opening. She was coming out, and whoever's been downstairs disappeared into the night. Come in. This time, the voice was dark, bubbling, like someone speaking underwater. All I got was a short glimpse. Her gorgeous brown hair hiding a strange face. Scaly skin that changed tint as I looked at it. Too many eyes. Some blue, some brown, some striking green. The components of the beautiful woman I'd seen scattered about something wrong. I would have stared at her forever had I not been instinctively backing away. I lost all balance as I reached the edge of the stairs and I tumbled backwards. It felt like an instant, like no time passed at all. I was suddenly on the ground floor looking up the stairs. I was bruised, my leg twisted. I could feel the front door, locked. Come in, I heard from the top of the stairs. Come in, come in, come in. A face peeked around the corner. It was rearranging, making itself pretty. Discarding old teeth to re-grow new ones. Little white molars danced their way down the stairs, only to turn to dust. She was changing hair colour to black, and her skin to a Mediterranean tan. She was starting to resemble my first girlfriend. I closed my eyes and turned to the front door. I heard clumsy footsteps slowly make their way down the stairs behind me. I screamed for help, forcing myself to my feet. Another footstep. Come in! I kept screaming for help, pounding on the thick glass. Come in! There was a sudden heat near me, someone warm and inviting. The smell of exotic fruit shampoo. Something resembling a hand reaching out to me, brushing against my jacket. Then someone stepped out. One of the old men from the bookstore. The beardless one. Instantly, I heard the footsteps behind me turn into a hurry back up the stairs. The old man unlocked the door as I scrambled out of the complex. My twisted leg couldn't support me, so I fell flat onto the pavement, crawling backwards. Away from the thing I'd seen and smelled. The old man looked confused. Call the police, I stammered. Call them, do, oh my God. The old man brought out his phone and dialed the emergency number. He kneeled down next to me, putting his hand on my shoulder. Are you okay? He asked. Did that man do something to you? What? The man. That young man by the stairs. Did he hurt you? I just sat there on the pavement. I barely even moved until the police came. I told them I'd been attacked. I told them there was something wrong with the one living in the Murray apartment. I told them about Reggie, about the girl in the window. I must have just kept babbling on as they took me back to their squad car. The owner of the bookstore just looked at me apologetically and waved goodbye, giving a short statement to one of the officers. I don't think they did a damn thing to whoever or whatever lives in that apartment. I think they did nothing, found nothing, and just chalked it up to me being hysterical. And getting mixed messages depending on the officer I ask about it. One says no one lives there, another says they're out of town. One claimed it was some sort of storage. No one's giving me a straight answer. I think Reggie is still out there. I think something was done to him, but I don't know what. I think he lost himself to whatever lives in that apartment. And sometimes, to this day, I stop by that corner to see if there's someone in that window. And sometimes, there is.